Welcome to the audiobook Sun Tzu Today, which reimagines the book The Art of War as a series of conversations between General Marcus Steele, a retired general in the U.S. Army, and his son, Colonel James Steele, who is learning from his father everything he can about military strategy, tactics, and leadership. If you like this audiobook, please like this and give us your comments. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, an ancient Chinese military treatise dating back to the 5th century BCE, is one of the most influential and enduring works on military strategy in human history. Its profound insights into the nature of conflict, leadership, and the strategic application of force have transcended the battlefield to influence countless fields, from business and politics to sports and personal development. The text's central themes, such as the importance of adaptability, the power of deception, and the value of understanding one's opponent, have resonated across cultures and time periods. Sun Tzu's emphasis on warfare's psychological and philosophical dimensions, rather than mere tactical considerations, revolutionized military thinking and laid the foundation for modern strategic studies. Military leaders, business executives, and academics have all studied and applied the work's timeless wisdom, solidifying its position as a pillar of strategic thought and demonstrating the persistence of ancient Chinese philosophy in the contemporary world. Now please enjoy this modern interpretation of the art of war with Sun Tzu Today. Chapter 1. Laying Plans. The old soldier sat at the head of the table, his weathered hands clasped before him, as he studied the chessboard that lay between him and his son. The pieces were arrayed in a complex pattern, black and white locked in a dance of strategy and sacrifice. It was a familiar sight to the soldier, a metaphor for the battles he had fought and the wars he had waged.
"Tell me, James,"
he said, his voice soft but firm.
"what do you see when you look at this board?"
James leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration.
I see a battle, Dad. A conflict between two opposing forces, each seeking to outmaneuver and overwhelm the other.
The soldier nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes.
"And what is the key to victory in such a battle?"
James hesitated, his gaze flickering over the pieces.
Superior numbers?
He ventured.
Better positioning?
"Those are factors, certainly.
The soldier said.
But they are not the heart of the matter.
He reached out, picking up one of the pawns and holding it up to the light.
In war, as in chess, victory goes to the side that can adapt, that can think beyond the immediate move and anticipate the actions of the enemy."
He set the pawn down, his eyes distant as he remembered the lessons he had learned on the battlefields of Afghanistan and Iraq.
"When I was in command, I had to make decisions that would determine the fate of hundreds, even thousands of lives. I had to weigh the risks and the rewards, the costs and the benefits. And I had to do it all while the bullets were flying and the bombs were falling."
James leaned back in his chair, his expression one of rapt attention.
How did you do it, Dad? How did you make those kinds of choices under that kind of pressure?
The soldier smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"By remembering the 5 factors that govern the art of war: the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline."
He tapped the chessboard, his finger resting on the white king.
"The moral law is the foundation, the bedrock upon which everything else is built. It is the sense of purpose, the belief in the righteousness of the cause that drives men to fight and die for their country."
His finger moved to the black bishop, a piece that could move in unexpected ways.
"Heaven represents the intangibles, the factors beyond our control, the weather, the terrain, the morale of the troops. A wise commander must be able to read the signs and adapt to the changing circumstances."
Next, he pointed to the pawns, the foot soldiers of the game.
"Earth is the ground upon which the battle is fought, the distances that must be covered, the obstacles that must be overcome. A general who understands the lay of the land can turn a disadvantage into an opportunity."
He picked up the white queen. the most powerful piece on the board.
The commander is the heart of the army, the embodiment of the virtues of wisdom, sincerity, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Without a strong leader, even the mightiest force can falter and fail.
Finally, he gestured to the neat rows of pieces, each in its proper place.
Method and discipline are the glue that holds it all together. The structure, the hierarchy, the training that allows an army to function as a cohesive unit. Without them, there is only chaos and confusion.
James nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the board.
I think I understand, Dad. But how does this apply to the world we live in now? To the threats we face from illegal immigration, terrorism, and rising powers like China and Russia?
The soldier sighed, leaning back in his chair.
The principles are the same, son, even if the specifics are different. We live in a world of complex and interconnected challenges, where the actions of one nation can have ripple effects that spread far beyond its borders.
He pointed to a news article on the table, the headline screaming of another border clash between India and China.
Take this, for example, a dispute over a remote mountain pass, a few square miles of territory. But beneath the surface, there are deeper currents at play. Questions of national pride, of economic and strategic interests, of the balance of power in the region.
James frowned, his forehead creased in thought.
So how do we respond to something like that? How do we protect our own interests while avoiding a larger conflict?
By understanding the motivations and capabilities of the other side.
The soldier said.
By being willing to negotiate and compromise where possible, but also being prepared to defend our principles and our people if necessary.
He tapped the article, his finger tracing the line of the disputed border.
In this case, the key is to find a way to de-escalate the situation, to create a face-saving way for both sides to back down without appearing weak or surrendering their core interests. It's a delicate balance, one that requires both strength and subtlety.
James nodded, his eyes bright with understanding.
Like in chess, right? Sometimes you have to sacrifice a piece to protect the king, or to set up a stronger position for the endgame.
The soldier smiled, pride shining in his eyes.
Exactly. And sometimes, the most powerful move is not to move at all, to wait and watch and gather information until the time is right to strike.
He leaned forward, his voice low and intense.
But there is one more factor that Sun Tzu didn't mention, one that is perhaps the most important of all, and that is the human factor, the courage and compassion and resilience of the men and women who serve on the front lines, who put their lives on the line for the sake of others.
James was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the chessboard.
Is that what you did, Dad? Is that what kept you going through all the years of war and conflict?
The soldier nodded, his gaze distant as he remembered the faces of the soldiers he had led, the friends he had lost.
It was, son. It was the knowledge that I was fighting for something bigger than myself, for the ideals and the institutions that make our nation great. And it was the bond of brotherhood, the sense of shared sacrifice and purpose that united us, even in the darkest of times.
He reached out, placing a hand on James's shoulder.
And that is what you must remember as you navigate the challenges of this new world, that no matter how complex the problems, no matter how daunting the obstacles, there is always hope, always the possibility of a better future, if we have the courage and the determination to fight for it.
James was quiet for a long moment, his eyes shining with emotion.
Thanks, Dad.
He said softly.
For everything. For the lessons, for the wisdom, for the example you've set. I know it hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you, and I'm grateful for all that you've done.
The soldier smiled, a soft, sad smile.
I'm proud of you too, son. And I know that you'll face the challenges ahead with the same strength and integrity that you've always shown. Just remember, when things get tough, when the way forward seems uncertain, to keep your head up and your heart true, and know that I'll always be here for you, no matter what.
James nodded, rising from his chair and embracing his father in a tight hug. For a long moment they stood there, two generations of soldiers, united by the bonds of family and the shared experience of war. And as they broke apart, the soldier knew that the lessons he had taught, the wisdom he had imparted, would live on, a legacy passed from father to son, from one defender of freedom to the next. For in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the battles won or lost, but the values and the ideals that endured, the light of liberty that could never be extinguished, no matter how dark the night. James walked to the window, looking out at the world beyond, a world of danger and uncertainty, but also of hope and possibility.
I'm ready, Dad.
He said, his voice steady and strong.
Ready to take on whatever challenges come my way. Ready to stand up for what I believe in, no matter the cost.
The soldier nodded, a fierce pride burning in his chest.
I know you are, son, and I know that you'll do great things, that you'll make a difference in this world, just as I tried to do.
He picked up a pawn from the chessboard, holding it out to James.
Remember, every piece has a role to play, every move has a purpose, and even the smallest action can change the course of history if it's made with courage and conviction.
James took the pawn, closing his fingers around it.
I will, Dad. I promise.
And with that, he turned and walked out into the gathering dusk, ready to take his place on the great chessboard of life, ready to play his part in the unending struggle for peace and justice in an uncertain world. The old soldier watched him go, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be trials and tribulations, sacrifices and setbacks. But he also knew that his son had the strength and the wisdom to face them, to stand tall in the face of adversity and fight for what was right. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, the soldier knew that the legacy of service and sacrifice would endure, passed down from generation to generation, a beacon of hope in a troubled world. For in the end, that was the true art of war, not the tactics or the strategies, but the courage and the compassion that lived in the hearts of those who served, the unbreakable spirit that would always rise to meet the challenges of the day. With a final nod of satisfaction, the old soldier turned back to the chessboard, ready to plan his next move in the great game of life, secure in the knowledge that the future was in good hands, guided by the timeless wisdom of Sun Tzu and the enduring values of honor, duty, and sacrifice. And so the lesson ended, but the legacy lived on, a shining example of what it meant to be a leader, a warrior, and a defender of freedom in an age of uncertainty and change. For in the heart of every soldier there burns an unquenchable fire, a passion for justice and a love of country that can never be extinguished, no matter how dark the night or how long the road ahead. Chapter 2. The Price of Prolonged Conflict. The old soldier sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the chessboard before him. The pieces were scattered, the once neat rows and columns, now a chaotic jumble of black and white. It was a familiar sight to the grizzled veteran, a metaphor for the conflicts he had lived through, the wars he had fought. Across from him sat his son James, his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied the board. The young man had grown up in a world very different from the one his father had known, a world of digital threats and asymmetric warfare, of drones and cyber attacks, and the constant specter of terrorism.
Tell me, James,
The old soldier said, his voice a low rumble.
what do you see when you look at this board? What lessons can we draw from the state of play?
James leaned forward, his fingers hovering over a pawn.
I see a stalemate, Dad. Neither side able to make a decisive move, both locked in a pattern of attack and defense, thrust and parry.
The father nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes.
And what does that tell you about the nature of conflict, about the realities of war in the modern age?
James was silent for a moment, his mind working.
That victory is elusive,
He said at last.
that even the most powerful armies can find themselves bogged down, unable to achieve their objectives, while the costs mount and the home front grows weary.
Exactly.
The old soldier said.
Sun Tzu understood this centuries ago. He warned of the dangers of prolonged warfare, of the way it saps the strength and resources of a nation, leaving it vulnerable to other threats.
He reached out, toppling the king with a flick of his finger.
In Afghanistan, in Iraq, we learned this lesson the hard way. We thought we could reshape entire societies, build nations from the ground up. But the longer we stayed, the more entrenched the opposition became, the more complex the challenges grew.
James picked up a knight, turning it over in his fingers.
But what choice did we have, Dad? We couldn't just walk away, leave a vacuum for the terrorists to fill.
The father sighed, leaning back in his chair.
There's always a choice, son. But sometimes the choices are between bad and worse. In war, the trick is to know when to push forward and when to pull back, when to double down and when to cut your losses.
He gestured to the board, to the scattered pieces.
Take this position. White has more pawns, more pieces in play, but black has a strong defensive line, a secure position. If white keeps pressing the attack, keeps throwing resources into a frontal assault, it will only exhaust itself while black continues to chip away at its flanks.
James nodded, seeing the wisdom in his father's words.
So what's the alternative? How do you break a stalemate like this?
The old soldier smiled, a crafty glint in his eye.
You change the game, son. You find a way to outflank your opponent, to strike at their weaknesses, to turn their strengths against them.
He reached out, moving a bishop across the board in a sudden, diagonal slash.
In Afghanistan, we tried to do this with drones, with targeted strikes against key leaders, but it was like playing whack-a-mole. Every time we took out one commander, another would pop up to take his place.
James frowned, considering the move.
So what's the answer then? How do you win a war like that, against an enemy that can blend into the population, that doesn't play by the rules?
The father was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant.
You don't, son. Not in the conventional sense, at least. In a war like that, the best you can hope for is to contain the threat, to keep it from spreading, to buy time for the local forces to grow strong enough to take the lead.
He leaned forward, his voice low and intense.
But even then, there are no guarantees. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, in Taiwan. The great powers are moving their pieces into place, testing each other's resolve. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the whole board could go up in flames.
James felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of the stakes involved.
So what do we do, Dad? How do we navigate a world like that, where the threats are so complex, so interconnected?
The old soldier reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder.
We stay vigilant, James. We invest in our alliances, in our partnerships. We build up our resilience, our ability to weather the storms that are sure to come.
He gestured to the chessboard, to the pieces still in play.
And we never forget the lessons of history, the warnings of the great strategists like Sun Tzu. We remember that war is a last resort, a terrible necessity. That the true test of a nation's strength is not how many battles it can win, but how many it can avoid.
James nodded, a new understanding dawning in his eyes.
And when we do have to fight, we fight smart. We adapt to the enemy's tactics. We use every tool in our arsenal. We don't get bogged down in endless quagmires, in wars of attrition that bleed us dry.
The father smiled, a fierce pride shining in his eyes.
Exactly, son. We fight to win, but we also know when to walk away, when to cut our losses, and live to fight another day.
He reached out, beginning to reassemble the scattered pieces on the board.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned that lesson the hard way. We thought we could reshape entire societies, build nations in our own image. But the more we tried to control, the more resistance we faced, the more chaos we unleashed.
James picked up a pawn, turning it over in his fingers.
So what's the alternative, Dad? How do you bring stability to a region like that without getting sucked into a forever war?
The old soldier sighed, his face etched with the weight of hard-won wisdom.
You focus on the basics, son. Security, governance, economic development. You work with local partners, empower them to take the lead. And you stay engaged, but with a light footprint, a limited presence.
He placed the last piece on the board, the kings standing tall, amid the ranks of pawns and rooks and knights.
It's a delicate balance, James. Too much intervention and you breed resentment, resistance. Too little and you create a vacuum, an opening for the bad actors to fill.
James nodded, seeing the complexity of the challenge.
And what about the home front, Dad? How do you maintain support for a mission like that when the costs are so high, the progress so slow?
The father leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant.
You level with the American people, son. You tell them the truth, the unvarnished reality. That there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. That the road ahead will be long and hard, but that the stakes are too high to walk away.
He fixed his son with a piercing gaze, his voice a low rumble.
And you lead by example, James. You show that you're willing to make the hard choices, to put the country's interests ahead of your own, that you're in it for the long haul, not just the next election cycle.
James felt a surge of pride, a sense of the legacy he was inheriting.
I understand, Dad. And I'm ready to take on that challenge, to do my part to keep our country safe, to defend the values we hold dear.
The old soldier smiled, a glint of steel in his eye.
I know you are, son. And I know it won't be easy. The world is a dangerous place, full of hidden threats and gathering storms. But I also know that as long as we hold fast to our principles, as long as we stand together as one nation, there is nothing we can't overcome, no challenge we can't meet.
He reached out, clasping his son's hand in a firm grip.
That's the lesson of history, James. That's the lesson of Sun Tzu and all the great strategists who came after him. In war, as in life, it's not the size of the army that matters, but the strength of its spirit, the depth of its resolve.
James nodded, feeling the weight of that wisdom settling on his shoulders.
And that's what we have to remember, Dad. That's what we have to hold on to, no matter what the future brings.
The old soldier rose to his feet, his bearing proud and erect.
Exactly, son. And that's what I want you to carry with you as you go out into the world, as you take up the mantle of leadership. Remember that the true measure of a nation's greatness is not the battles it wins, but the peace it preserves, the lives it lifts up, the hope it inspires.
He walked to the window, gazing out at the setting sun, the sky ablaze with orange and gold.
That's the legacy I want to leave, James. That's the legacy I want you to carry forward. A legacy of service, of sacrifice, of unwavering commitment to the ideals that make our country the beacon of freedom and opportunity it is.
James rose to stand beside his father, his eyes fixed on the horizon.
I will, Dad. I promise. And I'll never forget the lessons you've taught me, the wisdom you've shared. I'll carry it with me, always, and use it to guide me through whatever challenges lie ahead.
The old soldier smiled, a quiet pride shining in his eyes.
I know you will, son. I know you will. And I know that with young leaders like you, our country's future is in good hands, no matter what the world throws at us.
And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the two men stood together in silence, united by the bonds of blood and duty, of shared sacrifice and unwavering resolve. For they knew that in a world of gathering darkness, it was the light of their ideals, the strength of their spirit, that would guide them through, now and always. Chapter 3. The Art of Strategic Mastery. The old soldier walked with his son through the sprawling grounds of the family estate, the sun dappling the grass through the leaves of the ancient oaks. It was a place of peace and contemplation, a world away from the chaos and conflict that raged beyond its borders.
Tell me, James,
The father said, his voice soft but stern.
what do you know of the art of war? What lessons have you gleaned from the battles of the past, the struggles of the present?
The young man was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought.
I know that war is a terrible thing, Dad. A brutal, bloody business that leaves nothing but suffering and sorrow in its wake.
The father nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth.
That it is, son, that it is. But it is also an inescapable reality of the world we live in, a constant presence that shapes the course of nations and the fates of men.
He paused beneath a towering oak, its gnarled branches reaching out like the fingers of a wizened hand.
The question is not whether we will face war, James. The question is how we will face it, with what wisdom and courage and skill.
James looked up at his father, his eyes searching.
And what is the key to that, Dad? What is the secret to mastering the art of war?
The old soldier chuckled, a dry, humorless sound.
There is no secret, son, no magic formula or hidden truth. There is only the hard-won wisdom of generations, the lessons learned through blood and sacrifice and bitter experience.
He reached out, plucking a leaf from a low-hanging branch.
Sun Tzu understood this centuries ago. He knew that the true mastery of war lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to subdue, to break the enemy's will without ever firing a shot.
James frowned, puzzled.
But how is that possible, Dad? How can you defeat an enemy without fighting?
The father smiled, a glint of steel in his eye.
By understanding them, son, by knowing their strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and fears, by exploiting the cracks in their armor, the divisions in their ranks.
He crushed the leaf in his fist, the brittle fragments falling to the ground.
Take the situation in the Middle East, for example. For decades, we've been locked in a cycle of violence and retribution, of attack and counterattack. But what if we were to step back, to look at the larger picture?
James nodded, seeing where his father was going.
You mean look at the root causes of the conflict? The political and economic factors that fuel the violence?
Exactly,
The father said.
and not just the Middle East, but every hotspot around the globe. Ukraine, Taiwan, the border with Mexico, each one a tinderbox, waiting for a spark to set it ablaze.
He began to walk again, his steps slow and measured.
The key is to understand the dynamics at play, the interests and agendas of the various actors, to find the pressure points, the levers that can be pulled to shift the balance of power.
James hurried to keep pace, his mind racing.
But how do you do that, Dad? How do you gather that kind of intelligence, that level of insight?
The old soldier laughed, a sharp barking sound.
You don't, son. Not alone, at least. You build networks, alliances. You cultivate sources and assets, people who can give you the inside scoop, the ground truth.
He stopped at the edge of a small pond, the water still and mirror smooth.
And you never, ever stop learning, James. You study the history, the culture, the language of the places you're trying to influence. You immerse yourself in their world until you can think like them, feel like them.
James stared at his reflection in the pond, his face young and uncertain.
But what if it's not enough, Dad? What if the enemy is too strong, too determined to be swayed by subtlety and guile?
The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring.
Then you adapt, James. You find their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. You turn their strengths against them, use their own momentum to throw them off balance.
He pointed to a hawk circling high above, its keen eyes scanning the ground below.
You see that hawk, son? It doesn't attack head-on, doesn't try to overpower its prey with brute force. It waits, watches, bides its time until the moment is right, and then it strikes, swift and sure and deadly.
James nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes.
So that's the key then? Patience, precision, the ability to seize the opportune moment?
It's part of it.
The father said.
But there's more to it than that. There's the need for flexibility, for the ability to shift tactics on the fly, to respond to changing circumstances with speed and agility.
He gestured to the pond, to the ripples that spread out from a falling leaf.
In war, as in life, nothing is ever static, ever settled. The battlefield is always in flux, the enemy always adapting, evolving. To win, you must be able to do the same, to flow like water, to bend like the reed in the wind.
James was silent for a long moment, absorbing his father's words.
And what about the home front, Dad? How do you maintain the will to fight, the unity of purpose, when the conflict drags on and the costs mount?
The old soldier sighed, his face etched with the weight of memory.
You tell the truth, son. You level with the people, give them the unvarnished facts. You don't sugarcoat the difficulties. Don't downplay the sacrifices that will be required.
He turned to face his son, his eyes blazing with intensity.
But you also give them hope, James. You paint a vision of a better future, a world worth fighting for. You appeal to their highest ideals, their deepest values, and you call them to a common cause, a shared purpose.
James felt a shiver run down his spine, a sense of the awesome responsibility that his father had borne.
And what if they don't answer that call, Dad? What if they're too divided, too distrustful to come together as one?
The father's face hardened, his jaw clenching with resolve.
Then you lead, son. You set the example, show them the way forward. You take the hard decisions, make the tough calls, and you never, ever give up, no matter how dark the night or how long the odds.
He looked out over the pond, to the green hills beyond, and his voice took on a note of quiet conviction.
That's the essence of leadership, James. The willingness to bear any burden, pay any price, for the sake of the mission, the cause. To put the needs of others ahead of your own. To serve with honor and integrity and selfless devotion.
James felt a lump rising in his throat, a swelling of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him.
I don't know if I have that in me, Dad. I don't know if I'm strong enough, brave enough to bear that weight.
The old soldier smiled, a smile of infinite tenderness and understanding.
You are, son. You have it in you, the same fire, the same steel that has guided our family through generations of service and sacrifice. It's in your blood, your bones, your very marrow.
He took his son's face in his hands, his eyes shining with pride and love.
And you won't be alone, James. You'll have the wisdom of those who came before you, the strength of those who stand beside you. You'll have the love of your family, the support of your fellow citizens, the gratitude of a nation that knows the true meaning of duty and honor.
James felt a surge of emotion, a wave of determination and resolve.
I won't let you down, Dad. I won't let any of them down. I'll give everything I have, everything I am, to keep our people safe, our country strong.
The father pulled his son into a fierce embrace, his voice rough with emotion.
I know you will, son. I know you will. And I'll be with you every step of the way, in spirit, if not in body, guiding you, guarding you, giving you the strength to carry on, no matter what the future may bring.
And as they stood there, father and son, warrior and apprentice, James felt a sense of purpose, of destiny, settling over him like a mantle. He knew that the road ahead would be hard, the challenges daunting, the sacrifices immense. But he also knew that he was ready, that he had been preparing for this moment all his life, that he would not falter or fail, no matter how high the cost or how great the danger. For he was a son of soldiers, a scion of heroes, a bearer of a legacy that stretched back through centuries of courage and commitment. And he would not rest, would not yield, until he had done his duty, fulfilled his oath, and brought honor to the name he bore, the cause he served. With a final squeeze of his father's hand, James turned to face the world, his head held high, his heart full of hope and resolve. He was ready, at last, to take his place in the long line of patriots and warriors who had gone before him, to stand tall in the face of any foe, any threat, and to give all that he had, all that he was, in the defense of freedom, justice, and the American way. Chapter 4. Tactical Dispositions. The old soldier sat at the head of the dining table, his eyes fixed on the chessboard before him. The pieces were arranged in a complex pattern, a frozen moment in an intricate dance of strategy and deception. Across from him, his son James studied the board, his brow furrowed in concentration.
I don't see it, Dad.
He said at last, frustration creeping into his voice.
No matter how I look at it, there's no way to guarantee a win. Every move leaves an opening, a vulnerability that the enemy could exploit.
The father smiled, a knowing glint in his eye.
Ah, but that's the art of it, son. The true mastery lies not in the ability to win every battle, but in the skill to shape the battlefield itself, to create the conditions for victory before the first shot is ever fired.
He reached out, his weathered hand hovering over the board.
Think of it like this, James. In every conflict, there are two sides to the equation, the defensive and the offensive, the ability to protect oneself and the capacity to defeat the enemy.
With a deft flick of his wrist, he moved a pawn forward, exposing the king.
The novice seeks to secure his own position, to build an impenetrable fortress that no attack can breach. But the master understands that true security lies in the ability to control the flow of the game, to dictate the terms of engagement.
James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the new arrangement of pieces.
But how do you do that, Dad? How do you take the initiative, seize the advantage, when the enemy is just as determined, just as skilled?
The old soldier chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to fill the room.
By understanding the enemy, son, by knowing their strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and fears, by anticipating their moves before they even know they're going to make them.
He reached out again, this time moving a knight into a threatening position.
Take the situation with China and Taiwan, for example. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward case of territorial dispute, of two powers locked in a zero-sum game for control of a strategic island.
James nodded, his eyes fixed on the board.
But it's more than that, isn't it? There are deeper currents at play, historical grievances, and ideological differences that go back decades, even centuries.
Exactly.
The father said, his voice tinged with approval.
And to truly understand the nature of the conflict, to find a path to victory that doesn't lead to all-out war, you have to look beyond the surface, to the underlying dynamics that drive the behavior of both sides.
He moved another piece, a bishop sliding diagonally across the board.
The Chinese see Taiwan as a renegade province, a symbol of the humiliation they suffered at the hands of foreign powers in the past. They believe that reunification is their historical right, their manifest destiny.
James frowned, his forehead creasing with concentration.
And the Taiwanese? What motivates them to resist, to fight for their independence?
The old soldier sighed, his eyes distant.
Pride, mostly. A sense of identity, of cultural and political distinctiveness that they've nurtured over the years. They see themselves as a different people, with different values and aspirations, and they're willing to defend that identity with everything they have.
He moved a rook, the piece sliding smoothly across the board.
So the question becomes, how do you reconcile those competing visions? How do you find a way forward that allows both sides to save face, to claim a measure of victory without resorting to violence?
James was silent for a long moment, his gaze locked on the pieces before him.
You changed the game.
He said at last, his voice soft but certain.
You reframe the issue. Find a way to align their interests, to create a new equilibrium that both sides can live with.
The father's smile widened, a fierce pride shining in his eyes.
That's it, son. That's the heart of it. You don't just react to the enemy's moves, you anticipate them, shape them. You create the conditions for victory, not through force of arms, but through the skillful application of diplomacy, of economic leverage, of cultural influence.
He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, to the rolling hills beyond.
It's a delicate balance, James, a constant dance of give and take, of carrot and stick. But when it's done right, when the pieces fall into place just so, it's a thing of beauty, a triumph of the human spirit over the forces of chaos and destruction.
James felt a shiver run down his spine, a sense of the awesome responsibility that his father had borne.
And what about the other conflicts, Dad? The ones closer to home, like the border with Mexico, or the rising tide of domestic extremism?
The old soldier's face hardened, his jaw clenching with resolve.
The principles are the same, son. You have to look beyond the surface to the root causes of the conflict, the economic disparities, the social tensions, the political grievances that fuel the violence and the discord.
He gestured to the chessboard, to the intricate web of pieces and positions.
And then you have to find the pressure points, the levers that you can pull to shift the balance, to create a new equilibrium. It might be a targeted aid package or a reform of the immigration system. It might be a crackdown on hate groups or a national dialogue on race and reconciliation.
James nodded, his eyes alight with understanding.
But it all starts with knowledge, doesn't it? With the willingness to listen, to learn, to understand the perspectives of others, even when they differ from our own.
Absolutely.
The father said, his voice ringing with conviction.
And that's where the true strength of a nation lies, James. Not in its military might or its economic power, but in the wisdom and the compassion of its people. In their ability to see beyond their own narrow interests, to find common ground and forge a shared vision for the future.
He reached out, his hand resting on his son's shoulder.
That's the legacy I want to leave, James. A legacy of understanding, of empathy, of the unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity that has always been the hallmark of our family, our country.
James felt a lump rising in his throat, a swelling of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I won't let you down, Dad. I won't let any of them down. I'll carry that legacy forward, no matter the cost, no matter the sacrifice.
The old soldier smiled, a smile of infinite tenderness and understanding.
I know you will, son. I know you will, and you won't be alone. You'll have the strength of a nation behind you, the love and support of millions of Americans who share your values, your vision for a better world.
He turned back to the chessboard, his eyes glinting with a fierce, determined light.
And you'll have the wisdom of the ages to guide you, James, the lessons of Sun Tzu, of the great strategists and statesmen who came before. The knowledge that true victory lies not in the destruction of the enemy, but in the art of shaping the battlefield, of creating the conditions for a just and lasting peace.
James nodded, his heart swelling with pride and purpose.
I'm ready, Dad. Ready to take up the mantle, to carry on the fight for a world where all people can live in freedom, dignity, and security.
The father clasped his son's hand, his grip firm and unwavering.
Then let us begin, James. Let us chart a new course for this nation, for this world, a course guided by the principles of wisdom, of courage, of compassion. A course that leads not to the destruction of our enemies, but to the triumph of our highest ideals, our deepest values.
And with that, the two men bent over the chessboard once more, their minds and hearts united in a common cause, a shared vision of a future, bright with hope and possibility, a future where the art of war gave way to the art of peace, and the dream of a just and lasting world order became a reality at last. Chapter 5. Energy. The morning sun cast a warm glow through the kitchen window as James sat at the table, nursing a cup of coffee. His father, the old soldier, stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with the same precision and focus he had once brought to the battlefield.
You know,
The father said, his voice thoughtful.
I've been thinking a lot lately about the nature of conflict, about the ways in which the lessons of the past can inform the challenges of the present.
James looked up, his interest piqued.
What do you mean, Dad?
The old soldier slid a stack of pancakes onto a plate and carried it to the table.
Well, take the idea of direct and indirect attacks, for example. In war, you can't always confront the enemy head-on. Sometimes you have to find ways to undermine their resolve, to sap their will to fight.
He sat down across from his son, his eyes distant.
I remember a mission in Afghanistan, back in the early days of the war. We were tasked with taking out a high-value target, a Taliban leader who had been terrorizing the local population.
James leaned forward, his curiosity piqued.
What happened?
The father smiled, a thin, nostalgic smile.
We could have gone in guns blazing, stormed his compound, and taken him out by force. But that would have been costly, both in terms of lives and in terms of the damage it would have done to our relationship with the locals.
He took a bite of his pancake, chewing slowly.
So instead, we went the indirect route. We started by cutting off his supply lines, making it harder for him to get the weapons and the money he needed to keep his operation running. Then, we reached out to his rivals, the other warlords in the area, and we made them an offer they couldn't refuse.
James's eyes widened.
What kind of offer?
The old soldier's smile turned sly.
We told them that if they helped us take out our target, we would look the other way when it came to their own activities. We would give them a free hand to operate, as long as they didn't cross certain lines.
He leaned back in his chair, his expression pensive.
It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't entirely by the book, but it worked. Within a week, our target was dead, and the region was more stable than it had been in years.
James was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing.
But isn't that a dangerous precedent to set? Making deals with warlords, turning a blind eye to their crimes?
The father nodded, his face grave.
It is, son, and it's not a decision that any leader should make lightly. But in war, as in life, sometimes you have to choose between bad options and worse ones. Sometimes the only way to achieve a greater good is to get your hands dirty, to make compromises that you might not be entirely comfortable with.
He pushed his plate away, his appetite suddenly gone.
And that's a lesson that applies not just to the battlefield, but to the challenges we face today, here at home. The threat of domestic terrorism, the specter of nuclear war, these are problems that can't be solved by force alone. They require a more nuanced approach, a willingness to think outside the box and to use every tool at our disposal.
James frowned, his brow furrowed.
But how do you do that without losing sight of your principles, without becoming the very thing you're trying to fight against?
The old soldier was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant.
It's a fine line to walk, James, and it's one that I struggled with every day when I was in uniform. You have to be willing to make hard choices, to do things that might seem unpalatable in the moment, but that serve a greater purpose in the long run.
He stood up, carrying his plate to the sink.
But you also have to be true to yourself, to the values that define you as a person and as a leader. You have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning and know that you're doing the right thing, even if it's not always the easy thing.
James nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes.
I think I understand, Dad. It's about finding the balance, about being strategic and tactical, but also about being true to who you are and what you believe in.
The father smiled, a warm, proud smile.
Exactly, son. And that's a lesson that will serve you well, no matter what challenges you face in life. Whether you're leading soldiers on the battlefield or trying to navigate the complexities of the modern world, the principles are the same. It's all about adapting to the situation, about being flexible and creative, but also about staying true to your core values and your sense of purpose.
He walked over to the window, staring out at the sunlit street.
And that's something that I learned the hard way. through trial and error and a lot of painful mistakes. But it's a lesson that I wouldn't trade for anything because it's made me the man I am today, the leader I always aspired to be.
James stood up, joining his father at the window.
And that's the man I want to be too, Dad. Someone who can make a difference in the world, who can stand up for what's right and fight for what he believes in, no matter how hard it gets.
The old soldier put his arm around his son's shoulders, squeezing him tight.
And you will be, James. You have the heart and the mind and the courage to be a great leader, to make a real impact on the world. And I'll be there with you every step of the way, guiding you and supporting you and giving you the wisdom of my years.
They stood there for a long moment, father and son, warrior and apprentice, united by the bonds of love and duty and shared purpose. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the world below, they knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to face the darkness and the danger with the strength and the resolve of true heroes. For they were soldiers, guardians of the realm, and they would never rest until the world was safe and just and free. And though the road ahead was long and hard, though the enemies they faced were ruthless and relentless, they knew that they would prevail, not through might of arms or force of will, but through the power of their ideals and the purity of their hearts. They were the keepers of the flame, the defenders of the downtrodden, and they would never waver, never falter, never surrender. For they were the best and the brightest, the bravest and the boldest, and they would fight to the last breath, to the last drop of blood, to make the world a better place for all who called it home. And so, as the day wore on and the shadows lengthened, the old soldier and his son set to work, planning and preparing, training and strategizing, ready to face whatever the future might bring. For they knew, as the great generals of old had known, that the true art of war was not the art of destruction, but the art of creation, the art of building a world where all people could live in peace and dignity, where the strong protected the weak and the wise guided the foolish. And they would dedicate their lives to that art, to that sacred cause, knowing that in the end it was the only fight that truly mattered, the only victory that would endure. For in a world consumed by chaos and conflict, they would be the light, the beacon of hope and courage that would guide the way forward, now and always, unto the very end of days. Chapter 6. The Art of Adaptation. James sat on the porch swing, his gaze distant as he watched the sun slowly sink below the horizon. The old soldier, his father, sat beside him, a cold beer in one hand and a worn leather journal in the other.
You know,
The father said, his voice soft and contemplative,
I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about the other day, about the nature of conflict and the importance of adaptation.
James turned to look at his father, his brow furrowed.
What do you mean, Dad?
The old soldier took a sip of his beer, his eyes fixed on the fading light.
Well, it's like Sun Tzu said, water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe whom he is facing.
He opened the journal, flipping through the yellowed pages until he found the passage he was looking for.
When I was in Iraq, we were facing an enemy that was constantly evolving, constantly changing its tactics and its strategies. One day they would be using IEDs to target our convoys. The next, they would be launching mortar attacks on our bases.
James leaned forward, his interest piqued.
So how did you deal with that? How did you stay one step ahead?
The father smiled, a thin, knowing smile.
We adapted, son. We studied their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. We learned to think like them, to anticipate their moves before they made them.
He turned the page, his finger tracing a line of faded ink.
I remember one mission. We were tasked with taking out a high-value target, a bomb maker who had been responsible for dozens of attacks on coalition forces. We knew he was holed up in a compound on the outskirts of Baghdad, but we also knew that he had a network of informants and lookouts who would warn him if we tried to approach head-on.
James's eyes widened.
So what did you do?
The old soldier's smile turned sly.
We used their own tactics against them. We sent in a small team, disguised as locals, to infiltrate the compound and gather intelligence. At the same time, we staged a series of diversionary attacks on other targets in the area, drawing their attention away from our real objective.
He closed the journal, his expression pensive.
It was a risky move, and it could have gone badly wrong if we had been discovered. But it worked. We were able to get close enough to the target to take him out, without ever alerting his security detail.
James was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing.
But isn't that a dangerous way to operate? Relying on deception and misdirection instead of direct confrontation?
The father nodded, his face grave.
It can be, son, and it's not a tactic that should be used lightly. But in war, as in life, sometimes the most effective way to achieve your goals is to think outside the box, to use your enemy's strengths against them and exploit their weaknesses.
He set his beer down on the porch railing, his gaze distant.
And that's a lesson that applies not just to the battlefield, but to the challenges we face today, here at home. The threat of domestic terrorism, the specter of nuclear war. These are problems that require us to be nimble, to be adaptable, to think in ways that our adversaries might not expect.
James frowned, his brow furrowed.
But how do we do that without losing sight of our values, without becoming the very thing we're trying to fight against?
The old soldier was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful.
It's a fine line to walk, James, and it's one that requires a great deal of wisdom and discernment. We have to be willing to do what is necessary to protect our people and our way of life, but we also have to be true to the principles that define us as a nation, as a people.
He stood up, walking to the edge of the porch and leaning against the railing.
When I was in Afghanistan, I saw firsthand the consequences of losing sight of those principles. I saw good men, brave men, cross lines that should never have been crossed, all in the name of achieving a tactical advantage or a short-term gain.
James stood up, joining his father at the railing.
What happened to them, Dad? How did it end?
The father's face darkened, his jaw clenching with emotion.
It ended badly, son. For them, and for the people they were supposed to be protecting. They lost sight of what they were fighting for, of the values and the ideals that had brought them there in the first place.
He turned to face his son, his eyes blazing with intensity.
And that's a mistake that we cannot afford to make. Not now, not ever. We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, to be the beacon of light in a world that is all too often consumed by darkness and fear.
James nodded, his expression solemn.
I understand, Dad, and I promise I will do everything in my power to live up to that standard, to be the kind of leader that our country needs in these troubled times.
The old soldier smiled, a warm, proud smile.
I know you will, son, and I will be there with you every step of the way, guiding you and supporting you and giving you the wisdom of my years.
They stood there for a long moment, father and son, warrior and apprentice, united by the bonds of love and duty and shared purpose. And as the last light of day faded from the sky, they knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to face the darkness and the danger with the strength and the resolve of true heroes. For they were soldiers, guardians of the realm, and they would never rest until the world was safe and just and free. And though the road ahead was long and hard, though the enemies they faced were ruthless and relentless, they knew that they would prevail not through might of arms or force of will, but through the power of their ideals and the purity of their hearts. They were the keepers of the flame, the defenders of the downtrodden, and they would never waver, never falter, never surrender. For they were the best and the brightest, the bravest and the boldest, and they would fight to the last breath, to the last drop of blood, to make the world a better place for all who called it home. And so, as the night closed in around them, and the stars began to shine, the old soldier and his son set to work, planning and preparing, training and strategizing, ready to face whatever the future might bring. For they knew, as the great generals of old had known, that the true art of war was not the art of destruction, but the art of creation, the art of building a world where all people could live in peace and dignity, where the strong protected the weak and the wise guided the foolish. And they would dedicate their lives to that art, to that sacred cause, knowing that in the end, it was the only fight that truly mattered, the only victory that would endure. For in a world consumed by chaos and conflict, they would be the light, the beacon of hope and courage that would guide the way forward, now and always, unto the very end of days. Chapter 7. The Ghosts of War. The old soldier sat on the porch swing, a cold beer in his hand and a far-off look in his eye. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, lost in the swirling mists of memory. Beside him, his son James sat in silence, watching the play of emotions on his father's weathered face. He knew better than to interrupt when the old man was like this, caught in the grip of some dark and distant reverie. At last, the father spoke, his voice low and rough with emotion.
You know, James, there's something I've never told you about my time in the war. Something that's haunted me all these years, like a ghost that just won't let go.
James leaned forward, his eyes wide with concern.
What is it, Dad? You know you can tell me anything.
The old soldier took a long swig of his beer, his gaze still fixed on the horizon.
It was back in Iraq during the worst of the fighting. We were on a mission to take out a high-value target, a real nasty piece of work who'd been terrorizing the local population for months.
He paused, his face etched with pain.
We had him cornered, holed up in this little village in the middle of nowhere. It should have been a simple operation, in and out before anyone even knew we were there. But something went wrong, James. Something I'll never forgive myself for.
James reached out, placing a hand on his father's arm.
What happened, Dad?
The father's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his voice choked with emotion.
We were too late, son. By the time we got there, the bastard had already rigged the whole village with explosives. He knew we were coming, and he was ready for us.
He took a shuddering breath, his fingers tightening around the bottle.
I gave the order to move in, to take him down before he could set off the bombs. But I was wrong, James. I was so damn wrong.
James felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach.
What do you mean, Dad?
The old soldier's face crumpled, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs.
He set them off anyway, James. The whole damn village up in smoke and flames. And it was all my fault, son. All those innocent lives snuffed out in an instant because of my bad judgment, my reckless desire to play the hero.
James was silent for a long moment, his mind reeling with the horror of his father's confession. At last, he spoke, his voice soft and full of compassion.
It wasn't your fault, Dad. You were just doing your job, trying to protect people from a monster who would have killed them all anyway.
The father shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips.
That's what I told myself, James. For years, that's how I justified it, how I lived with the guilt and the shame. But the truth is, I should have known better. I should have found another way, a better way.
He looked up at his son, his eyes haunted and full of pain.
And that's why I'm telling you this now, James, because I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did, to let your pride or your anger or your fear cloud your judgment when it matters most.
James nodded, a sense of understanding dawning on his face.
Is that what you meant, Dad, when you talked about the art of studying circumstances? Of knowing when to attack and when to hold back?
The old soldier smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
Exactly, son. In war as in life, timing is everything. You have to be able to read the situation, to understand the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, to know when to press your advantage and when to bide your time.
He set his beer down on the porch railing, his gaze distant and thoughtful.
But it's more than that, James. It's about understanding yourself, your own motivations and biases, your own blind spots and vulnerabilities. Because in the end, the greatest enemy you'll ever face is the one inside your own head, the one that tells you you're invincible, that you can do no wrong.
James was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing with the implications of his father's words. At last, he spoke, his voice steady and full of conviction.
I understand, Dad, and I promise I won't let you down. I'll remember what you've taught me, and I'll use it to make the world a better place, to fight for what's right and just and true.
The old soldier felt a surge of pride, a sense of hope for the future that had long eluded him.
I know you will, son. I know you will. And I'll be with you every step of the way, guiding you and supporting you, giving you the strength and the wisdom to face whatever lies ahead.
He reached out, pulling his son into a tight embrace.
But there's one more thing I need to tell you, James. One more lesson that I learned the hard way, through blood and sweat and tears.
James pulled back, his eyes searching his father's face.
What is it, Dad?
The father's voice was low and intense, his gaze locked on his son's.
Never forget who you are, James. Never forget where you came from, or the values that define you as a person and as an American. Because in the end, that's all you have, all that truly matters in this world.
He gestured to the rolling hills beyond, to the land that had shaped and sustained them for generations.
This is our home, son. This is the legacy we've been entrusted with, the dream we've been called to defend. And no matter how dark the night or how long the road, we'll never stop fighting for it, never stop believing in the power of our ideals and the resilience of our spirit.
James nodded, his eyes shining with a fierce, determined light.
I won't forget, Dad. I swear it, on everything I hold dear. I'll carry on the legacy you've left, the values you've taught me, no matter what it takes.
The old soldier smiled, a smile of infinite love and pride.
I know you will, son. I know you will. And together, we'll face whatever the future brings, armed with the wisdom of the ages and the strength of our convictions. For we are Americans, and we will never surrender, never give in to despair or defeat.
And as the last light of day faded from the sky and the stars began to shine, the father and son sat together in silence, united by the bonds of love and duty, of shared sacrifice and unwavering courage. They knew that the road ahead would be long and hard, that the challenges they faced were great and many. But they also knew that they would face those challenges together, guided by the timeless principles of war and the enduring values of their nation. They would fight for what they believed in, for the freedom and dignity of all people. And in the end, they would prevail. Not through force of arms or strength of numbers, but through the power of their ideals and the purity of their hearts. For they were soldiers, guardians of the realm, and they would never rest until the world was safe and just and free. And though the ghosts of war might haunt them still, though the wounds of the past might never fully heal, they would bear their scars with pride and honor, knowing that they had fought the good fight and kept the faith, now and always, unto the very end of days. Chapter 8. The Art of Modern War. The crackling fire cast long shadows across the study, its warm glow a stark contrast to the chill that had settled into the old soldier Steele's bones. He leaned back in his leather armchair, swirling a tumbler of amber liquid, his weathered face etched with the lines of countless battles fought and won.
You asked about Kandahar, son,
The old soldier said, his voice gravelly with age and memories.
It's not a pretty tale, but it's one you need to hear.
Across from him, Captain James Steele leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on his father. The younger man's uniform was crisp, his posture straight, but there was an eagerness in his gaze that betrayed his youth.
I'm ready, Dad.
James replied, his voice steady.
I need to understand.
The old soldier took a long sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn.
It was 2009. The Taliban had regrouped, and we were facing a new kind of war. Sun Tzu said, "In difficult country, do not encamp. But sometimes, son, you don't have a choice."
The general's mind drifted back to the dusty streets and rugged mountains of Afghanistan.
We were tasked with clearing out a Taliban stronghold in the outskirts of Kandahar. Intelligence was sketchy at best, and the terrain, it was a nightmare. High roads intersecting everywhere, perfect for ambushes.
James nodded, absorbing every word.
So what did you do?
We joined hands with our allies.
The old soldier replied, echoing Sun Tzu's words.
Local Afghan forces who knew the lay of the land, but even then, we were in a hemmed-in situation. The enemy had the high ground, and we were exposed.
The old general's eyes grew distant.
That's when I learned the true meaning of "in desperate position, you must fight." We had no choice but to push forward, even though every instinct screamed to retreat.
James leaned back, his brow furrowed.
But you succeeded, right? I mean, you're here.
The old soldier let out a bitter laugh.
Success? That's a loaded word in war, son. We took the position, but at a cost. I lost good men that day, friends. And for what? A hill that we couldn't even hold for more than a few months.
The younger Steele's face fell.
I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to.
The old soldier waved him off.
No, you need to hear this. Sun Tzu talks about the art of varying one's plans, of blending considerations of advantage and disadvantage. In Kandahar, I learned that lesson the hard way.
He set down his glass, leaning forward.
We had a plan, a good one on paper. But when the bullets started flying and the IEDs began exploding, everything went to hell. I had to make split-second decisions that would determine who lived and who died.
James swallowed hard.
How did you do it?
By remembering another of Sun Tzu's teachings, the art of war teaches us to rely not on the likelihood of the enemy's not coming, but on our own readiness to receive him. We adapted, improvised. When our primary route was compromised, we split our forces, using the complex road network to our advantage.
The general's voice grew softer.
But there was a cost to that decision. The squad I sent to flank the enemy, they never made it back. Staff Sergeant Mike Holloway, your godfather, he was leading that team.
James's eyes widened.
Uncle Mike? I never knew.
The old soldier nodded solemnly.
He was a good man, one of the best. His loss, it nearly broke me. But a general can't afford to be over-solicitous for his men. It's one of the 5 dangerous faults Sun Tzu warns about.
The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of unspoken grief hanging in the air. Finally, James spoke.
So what happened next?
The old soldier stood, walking to a map of Afghanistan pinned to the wall.
We pressed on, used every trick in the book to keep the enemy off balance. Reduced the hostile chiefs by inflicting damage on them, Sun Tzu said. We targeted their leadership, disrupted their supply lines, and kept them constantly engaged.
He traced a line across the map with his finger.
It was a grueling campaign, weeks of intense fighting, sleepless nights, and gut-wrenching decisions. But in the end, we took the hill.
James joined his father at the map.
And then?
The old soldier turned to face his son, his expression grave.
And then we learned another harsh lesson. There are some positions which must not be contested, some commands of the sovereign which must not be obeyed.
The younger Steele's brow furrowed.
I don't understand.
Politics, son.
The old soldier spat the word like a curse.
While we were fighting and dying on that godforsaken hill, the politicians back home were making deals. By the time the dust settled, we were ordered to withdraw. All that blood, all those lives, for nothing.
James's fists clenched at his sides.
That's not right.
No, it's not.
The old soldier agreed.
But it's the reality of modern warfare. The battlefield extends far beyond the front lines. It's in the halls of power, in the media, in the court of public opinion.
The general returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years.
That's why I'm telling you this, James. The principles of war that Sun Tzu laid out over 2,000 years ago, they're still relevant. But you need to understand how to apply them in today's world.
James nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to see that.
The old soldier leaned forward, his gaze intense.
Good, because the threats we face now are more complex than ever. Cyber warfare, economic manipulation, disinformation campaigns, these are the new battlefields.
The younger Steele's eyes lit up with understanding.
And that's why you've been pushing for the new Joint Task Force, isn't it? To adapt to these new threats?
A small smile played at the corners of the old soldier's mouth.
You're catching on quick, son. Yes, that's exactly it. We need to be ready to face enemies who don't play by the old rules, who strike from the shadows and disappear before we can retaliate.
James began to pace, his mind racing.
So how do we do it? How do we apply Sun Tzu's principles to this new kind of warfare?
The old soldier leaned back, a hint of pride in his eyes as he watched his son work through the problem.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But let's break it down. What did we just discuss about Sun Tzu's teachings?
The captain stopped pacing, his brow furrowed in concentration.
Well, there's the importance of adaptability, of varying one's plans, and the need to understand both the advantages and disadvantages of any situation.
Good.
The old soldier nodded.
What else?
The emphasis on readiness, on being prepared for any eventuality.
James continued.
And the warning against the 5 dangerous faults that can affect a leader.
The general smiled.
Excellent. Now, how might we apply these principles to the challenges we face today?
James thought for a moment.
Well, in terms of adaptability, we need to be constantly evolving our strategies to keep up with emerging threats. Cyber warfare, for example. We can't rely on traditional defense methods. We need to be as agile and innovative as our adversaries.
The old soldier nodded approvingly.
Go on.
As for understanding advantages and disadvantages,
James continued, warming to the topic.
we need to have a comprehensive view of the global landscape, not just military strength, but economic factors, diplomatic relationships, technological capabilities, everything that could impact our strategic position.
The older Steele's eyes gleamed with pride.
You're on the right track, son. And what about readiness?
James paced again, his mind working furiously.
In today's world, readiness means more than just having troops and equipment prepared. It means having robust cybersecurity measures in place, maintaining strong alliances, and having the flexibility to respond to unconventional threats.
Excellent.
The old soldier said.
And the 5 dangerous faults?
The captain paused, considering.
They're still relevant, aren't they? Recklessness could lead to escalating conflicts unnecessarily. Cowardice. Well, in today's political climate, that might manifest as a failure to stand up to aggression, whether it's cyber attacks or economic bullying.
The old soldier nodded, gesturing for James to continue.
A hasty temper could be disastrous in delicate diplomatic situations, James went on. And oversensitivity to shame, in an age of social media and instant global communication, that could lead to rash decisions based on public perception rather than strategic necessity.
And over-solicitude?
The old soldier prompted. James frowned.
That's a tough one. In modern warfare, where the lines between civilian and combatant are often blurred, how do we balance the need to protect our people with the necessity of achieving our objectives?
The general leaned forward, his expression serious.
That, son, is the question that keeps men like me up at night. It's why we need leaders who can navigate these complex moral and strategic landscapes.
A comfortable silence fell between them as James digested his father's words. Finally, He spoke again.
Dad, can I ask you something?
The old soldier nodded.
Of course.
After Kandahar, after everything you've been through, how do you keep going? How do you stay committed to this path?
The old general's eyes softened.
It's not easy, James. There are nights when the ghosts come calling, when the weight of the decisions I've made feels
He stood, walking to a shelf lined with photographs, smiling soldiers, medal ceremonies, moments frozen in time.
But then I remember why we do this. Not for glory, not for power, but for the people we swore to protect, for the ideals we believe in.
The old soldier turned back to his son, his gaze steady.
Sun Tzu said, "The art of war is of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin." In our world, with the threats we face, that's truer than ever.
James nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes.
So we keep fighting, keep adapting, keep trying to stay one step ahead.
Exactly.
The old soldier said, a note of fierce pride in his voice.
Because the alternative is unthinkable. We are the thin line that stands between civilization and chaos, son. It's a heavy burden, but one we must bear.
The younger Steele straightened, squaring his shoulders.
I understand, Dad, and I'm ready to do my part.
The old soldier clasped his son's shoulder, his grip firm.
I know you are, James. You've got a good head on your shoulders and a strong moral compass. Just remember the lessons we've discussed tonight. They may save your life one day, and the lives of those under your command.
As the fire burned low and the night deepened, father and son continued their discussion, delving deeper into the intricacies of modern warfare and the timeless wisdom of Sun Tzu. Outside, the world spun on, fraught with dangers both seen and unseen. But within the study, a torch was being passed, the knowledge and experience of one generation handed down to the next, preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The conversation between the old soldier, and Captain James Steele would continue long into the night, touching on topics ranging from the ethical implications of drone warfare to the potential consequences of artificial intelligence in military strategy. Each point circled back to the fundamental principles laid out by Sun Tzu, demonstrating how ancient wisdom could be applied to even the most modern of conflicts. As dawn broke, casting its pale light through the study windows, both men felt a renewed sense of purpose. They understood that the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with complex decisions and moral quandaries. But they also knew that by holding true to the core principles of strategic thinking and ethical leadership, they could navigate the treacherous waters of modern warfare. Chapter 9. Chapter 8. The High Ground. The gentle click of chess pieces on the board filled the study, a stark contrast to the weighty silence that hung between father and son. General Steele, the old soldier, studied the board intently, his weathered hands hovering over a knight as he contemplated his next move. Across from him, Captain James Steele leaned back in his chair, eyes darting between the chessboard and his father's face. The game had become more than just a pastime. It was a battlefield of its own, where strategies were tested and lessons imparted.
You're exposed on your left flank.
The old soldier said quietly, finally moving his knight.
Always be mindful of your weaknesses, even as you press an advantage.
James nodded, studying the new configuration.
Like in Helmand Province?
He asked, his voice carefully neutral. The old soldier's hand paused mid-air, his eyes flickering up to meet his son's.
You've been doing your research?
I have.
James admitted.
But I want to hear it from you, Dad. What really happened there?
The old general leaned back, his gaze distant.
Helmand. That was a hard-fought campaign. We were tasked with clearing out Taliban strongholds along the Helmand River Valley. Crucial territory, both strategically and symbolically.
James moved a pawn, opening up a line for his bishop.
I've read the official reports, but they don't tell the whole story, do they?
The old soldier shook his head, a wry smile playing at his lips.
They never do, son. The reality on the ground is always messier, more complex than any report can capture.
He gestured to the chessboard.
Take this game. On paper, it's simple. Two sides, clearly defined pieces, set rules of engagement. But in practice, it's about reading your opponent, anticipating moves, adapting your strategy on the fly.
James leaned forward, intrigued.
So how did you approach Helmand?
The old soldier's eyes lit up with the fire of remembered battles.
We started by securing the high ground. Sun Tzu said, camp in high places facing the sun. In Helmand, that meant taking control of the ridgelines overlooking the valley.
He moved his bishop, threatening James's queen.
It wasn't easy. The terrain was brutal. Steep cliffs, narrow paths, perfect territory for ambushes. But we knew that controlling those heights was crucial for observation and fire support.
James frowned, moving his queen to safety.
But didn't that make you vulnerable? Exposed on the ridgelines?
The old soldier nodded approvingly.
Good question. It did carry risks. But remember another of Sun Tzu's principles. If you are careful of your men and camp on hard ground, the army will be free from disease of every kind, and this will spell victory.
He leaned forward, his voice intense.
We fortified those positions, James, used every advantage the terrain offered, and from there, we could observe enemy movements in the valley below, direct air support, and control the flow of battle.
James absorbed this, his mind racing.
So you turned a potential vulnerability into a strength?
Exactly.
The old soldier said, pride evident in his voice.
But it wasn't just about the physical high ground. We also had to secure the moral high ground.
The younger Steele's brow furrowed.
What do you mean?
The old soldier sighed, his expression growing somber.
Helmand was poppy country. The Taliban financed their operations through the opium trade. We couldn't just go in guns blazing without considering the impact on the local population.
He moved another piece, his voice thoughtful.
Sun Tzu said, "The enlightened ruler lays his plans well ahead. The good general cultivates his resources." In Helmand, that meant working with local leaders, offering alternatives to poppy cultivation, building schools and clinics.
James nodded slowly.
Hearts and minds?
Precisely.
The old soldier agreed.
Because we understood that the real battle wasn't just against the Taliban. It was for the trust and support of the Afghan people.
The chess game continued, moves and counter-moves mirroring the ebb and flow of their conversation. James found himself drawn in, not just by the strategy of the game, but by the deeper lessons his father was imparting.
There was one operation,
The old soldier continued, his voice low,
that really drove home the importance of Sun Tzu's teachings. We had intel on a major Taliban gathering in a village near the Kajaki Dam.
James leaned in, captivated.
What happened?
The old soldier's eyes grew distant, reliving the memory.
It was a complex situation. The village was in a valley, surrounded by hills, easy to defend, hard to assault, and we knew there were civilians present.
He moved his rook, capturing one of James's pawns.
We could have called in an airstrike, taken out the entire compound. But that would have meant civilian casualties, and potentially turned the local population against us.
James nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes.
So you had to find another way.
Exactly.
The old soldier said,
We drew on another of Sun Tzu's principles. The highest form of generalship is to balk the enemy's plans. Instead of a frontal assault, we used deception.
He detailed the operation, how they had used false radio transmissions and decoy movements to make the Taliban think an attack was coming from the east. Meanwhile, the real assault force had moved through a series of hidden ravines to approach from the west.
We struck at dawn.
The old soldier continued, his voice tight with remembered tension.
The sun at our backs blinding the enemy. We had the element of surprise, and we made it count.
James listened, enraptured, as his father described the fierce but brief battle that followed, how they had managed to capture key Taliban leaders while minimizing civilian casualties.
It wasn't a perfect operation.
The old soldier admitted.
We lost good men that day, but we achieved our objectives, and we did it in a way that maintained our moral standing with the local population.
The chess game had been forgotten, the pieces standing silent witness to the weight of history being shared between father and son. James sat back, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd heard.
Dad, how do you balance it all? The strategic necessities, the moral considerations, the lives of your men?
The old soldier's eyes met his son's, filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow.
It's never easy, James. Every decision carries weight, consequences that you have to live with.
He gestured to the chessboard.
In chess, sacrificing a piece is a strategic choice. In war, every piece represents a life, a family, a future. You have to weigh each move carefully, understanding that there are no perfect solutions.
The old general's voice grew softer.
Sun Tzu said, "The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom." That's what we strive for, son, to make the best decisions we can, not for glory or recognition, but for the good of those we've sworn to protect.
James nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes.
I think I'm starting to see why you pushed me to study history, to learn from the past.
The old soldier smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his usual stoic demeanor.
The principles of war don't change, James. The technology, the political landscape, they're always evolving. But the fundamental truths about strategy, about leadership, about the human cost of conflict, those remain constant.
He reached out, clasping his son's shoulder.
That's why I'm sharing these stories with you, not to glorify war, but to prepare you for the complex realities you'll face as a leader.
James straightened, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders.
I understand, Dad, and I'm grateful. But how do you deal with the cost? The lives lost? The decisions that haunt you?
The old soldier's eyes clouded, and for a moment, James saw the full weight of his father's experiences etched in the lines of his face.
You carry them with you, son. Every life lost, every hard decision, they become part of you. But you use that weight to ground you, to remind you of the stakes, to fuel your determination to do better, to save more lives in the future.
He gestured to a shelf lined with books, histories, biographies, ancient texts of strategy.
And you study. You learn from those who came before, from your own mistakes and triumphs. You strive to embody Sun Tzu's ideal of the enlightened general, one who wins without fighting, who understands both himself and his enemy.
James absorbed this, his mind racing with the implications.
It's a heavy burden.
He said quietly. The old soldier nodded, his expression softening.
It is, but it's also a profound responsibility and an opportunity to make a real difference in the world.
He turned back to the chessboard, surveying the pieces with a critical eye.
Now, let's finish this game. Remember, in chess as in war, the goal isn't just to defeat your opponent, it's to outthink them, to see the board as a whole, to set up victories 3 or 4 moves in advance.
As they resumed their match, the conversation shifted, touching on current global hotspots, emerging threats, and the challenges of modern warfare. James found himself drawing parallels between the chess strategies and the larger geopolitical landscape, his understanding deepening with each move. The sun had set by the time they finished, casting long shadows across the study. As James stood to leave, he paused, turning back to his father.
Dad,
He said, his voice thick with emotion.
thank you for sharing this with me, for everything.
The old soldier met his son's gaze, his eyes shining with pride and a hint of moisture.
You're welcome, James. Remember, leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions, about constant learning and adaptation.
He gestured to the chessboard, now reset and ready for a new game.
We'll continue these discussions. There's so much more to cover: the importance of supply lines, the role of intelligence, the delicate balance of alliances.
James nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As he left the study, his mind was already racing, connecting the ancient wisdom of Sun Tzu with the complex realities of modern warfare. He understood now that his journey was just beginning, a lifelong path of learning, leadership, and the weighty responsibility of command. Behind him, General the Old Soldier Steele watched his son go, a mixture of pride and concern etched on his weathered features. He knew the challenges that lay ahead for James, the difficult decisions and heavy burdens he would face, but he also saw in his son the potential to become the kind of leader the world desperately needed. One who could navigate the treacherous waters of modern conflict with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering principle. As the night deepened, the old soldier turned back to his books and maps, preparing for the next lesson, the next game of strategy. For in this endless chess match of global politics and military maneuvering, the learning never truly ended. And, in that continuous evolution of tactics and understanding, lay the best hope for peace in an ever-changing world. Chapter 10. The Six Terrains. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape as General Steele's SUV wound its way through the mountain pass. Beside him, Captain James Steele gazed out the window, his mind churning with the lessons of the past few days.
You're quiet this morning, son?
The old soldier observed, his eyes never leaving the treacherous road ahead. James turned to his father, a wry smile playing at his lips.
Just thinking about our chess game last night, and everything else you've been teaching me.
The old soldier nodded, a hint of pride in his voice.
Good. A leader should always be reflecting, analyzing. So, what's on your mind?
James hesitated, then plunged ahead.
I've been thinking about terrain, actually. How it shaped your strategies in Afghanistan, and how it applies to modern warfare.
The old general's eyebrows rose in surprise.
Terrain, eh? Sun Tzu had quite a bit to say about that. Do you remember the 6 kinds of terrain he described?
James furrowed his brow, recalling their previous discussions.
Let's see. There was accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, and positions at a great distance from the enemy.
The old soldier nodded approvingly.
Well remembered. Now look at the landscape around us. What do you see?
James studied the rugged mountains, the winding road, the steep cliffs.
I see. A mix of terrains. Those narrow passes we just came through. The high ridges above us. It's a complex battlefield.
Exactly.
The old soldier said, his voice taking on the tone of a seasoned instructor.
In modern warfare, we rarely have the luxury of dealing with just one type of terrain. We have to be prepared for rapid shifts, for fighting in urban environments one day and mountain passes the next.
He gestured to a particularly treacherous stretch of road ahead.
Take that section, for instance. It's a perfect example of what Sun Tzu would call a narrow pass. How would you approach it tactically?
James leaned forward, his mind racing.
Well, Sun Tzu said, with regard to narrow passes, if you can occupy them first, let them be strongly garrisoned and await the advent of the enemy. So, I'd want to secure that position early, set up defensive positions with good fields of fire.
The old soldier nodded, a small smile playing at his lips.
Good. But what if the enemy got there first?
Then, we'd need to assess their strength.
James replied, gaining confidence.
Sun Tzu advised against attacking a well-garrisoned pass. We'd need to find another route or try to draw them out.
Excellent.
the old soldier said.
Now, apply that thinking to a modern context. How might these principles of terrain play out in today's conflicts?
James thought for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the landscape.
Well, in urban warfare, city streets could be seen as a network of narrow passes, controlling key intersections, high-rise buildings for observation. It's the same principle, just in a different setting.
The old soldier's eyes lit up with pride.
Now you're thinking like a strategist, son. The fundamentals don't change, even as the battlefield evolves. But remember, terrain isn't just physical anymore.
James turned to his father, intrigued.
What do you mean?
In the modern age, we have to consider digital terrain as well.
The old soldier explained.
Cyberspace has its own geography, its own strategic high grounds and vulnerable passes.
He launched into a description of a cyber operation he'd overseen in his later years of service. It involved securing critical digital infrastructure against a sophisticated state-sponsored attack.
We had to think in terms of network topology, of data flows and access points.
The old soldier said.
It was like securing a vast invisible landscape. We had our narrow passes in the form of firewalls and access controls, our precipitous heights in secure servers and encrypted communications.
James listened, fascinated by the parallels.
So you applied the same strategic principles to this digital battlefield?
Exactly.
The old soldier nodded.
We sought to occupy the high ground early, to control key terrain in the form of critical nodes and data pathways. We set up our defenses, anticipated the enemy's moves, and used deception to lure them into traps.
The SUV rounded a bend, revealing a breathtaking vista of the valley below. The old soldier pulled over at a scenic overlook, killing the engine.
Look out there, James,
he said, his voice quiet but intense.
What do you see?
James surveyed the landscape, taking in the patchwork of forests, fields, and distant urban sprawl.
I see. A complex battle space. Multiple terrains. Interconnected systems.
The old soldier nodded approvingly.
Good. Now, imagine overlaying that with the invisible terrain of cyberspace, of electronic warfare, of information operations. That's the reality of modern conflict.
He turned to face his son fully.
Sun Tzu said, "The natural formation of the country is the soldier's best ally, but a power of estimating the adversary, of controlling the forces of victory, and of shrewdly calculating difficulties, dangers, and distances constitutes the test of a great general." In today's world, that means understanding not just physical terrain, but the entire spectrum of modern warfare.
James absorbed this, his mind racing with the implications.
It's overwhelming,
he admitted.
How do you even begin to tackle such complexity?
The old soldier's expression softened.
You start with the fundamentals, son. You study, you prepare, you surround yourself with experts in every domain, and you never stop learning.
He launched into a story from his time commanding a joint task force, describing how they had to coordinate actions across multiple domains: land, air, sea, cyber, and space.
It was like conducting a grand symphony.
The old soldier said, his eyes distant with memory.
Each element had its role, its own terrain to navigate, but they all had to work in harmony to achieve our objectives.
James listened, enraptured, as his father detailed the intricacies of modern joint operations. The conversation flowed, touching on everything from the challenges of multi-domain command and control to the ethical considerations of cyber warfare.
As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the old soldier started the SUV again, continuing their journey. But the discussion didn't cease, evolving to cover Sun Tzu's warnings about the 6 calamities that can befall an army: flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout.
James recited.
How do these apply in today's military?
The old soldier's expression grew serious.
They're as relevant now as they were in Sun Tzu's time. perhaps even more so given the complexities we face.
He detailed examples from recent conflicts, how poor morale could lead to flight, how unclear command structures could result in insubordination or collapse. He spoke of the dangers of disorganization in the face of rapidly evolving threats, and how overconfidence or poor intelligence could lead to rout.
But the most dangerous calamity in today's world,
the old soldier said, his voice grave,
is what I'd call strategic myopia. Failing to see the big picture, to understand how actions in one domain can have cascading effects across others.
James nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders.
So how do we guard against these calamities?
The old soldier's voice took on the tone of a seasoned commander.
By embodying the qualities Sun Tzu described, the general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom.
He went on to stress the importance of clear communication, of fostering trust and respect among one's troops, of maintaining discipline while also showing genuine care for one's soldiers.
Regard your soldiers as your children.
The old soldier quoted,
and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death.
As they neared their destination, a military training facility nestled in the mountains, the old soldier turned to his son one last time.
Remember, James,
he said, his voice filled with both pride and concern,
knowing the terrain, both physical and metaphorical, is only part of the equation. Sun Tzu said it best. If you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete.
James met his father's gaze, feeling the full weight of the wisdom being passed down to him.
I understand, Dad, and I'm ready to keep learning, to face whatever challenges lie ahead.
As they pulled into the facility, both men fell silent, lost in thought. The lessons of the day, the wisdom of Sun Tzu, and the complexities of modern warfare swirled in their minds. For James, it was the beginning of a new chapter in his military career, armed with ancient wisdom and modern insight. For the old soldier, it was the culmination of a lifetime of service, passing on the hard-earned knowledge to the next generation of leaders. The terrain ahead was complex, filled with both danger and opportunity. But with the foundations laid by Sun Tzu and the insights gained from generations of warriors, they were prepared to navigate whatever challenges the future might hold. Chapter 11. The 9 Grounds. The gentle clinking of ice cubes against glass punctuated the comfortable silence in General Steele's study. Outside, the summer sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. James Steele, freshly showered after his evening run, settled into the leather armchair across from his father. The old soldier raised an eyebrow, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth.
Productive day at the Pentagon, son?
James snorted, reaching for his own glass of scotch.
If by productive you mean drowning in bureaucratic red tape and interdepartmental squabbles, then sure.
He took a sip, savoring the smoky burn.
Sometimes I wonder if Sun Tzu ever had to deal with budget meetings and PowerPoint presentations.
The old general's laugh was a low rumble.
Oh, I'm sure he did in his own way. The art of war isn't just about battlefield tactics, you know. It's about navigating all the complexities that surround conflict, including the political maneuvering back home.
James leaned forward, intrigued.
Speaking of Sun Tzu, I've been meaning to ask you about something he wrote. The 9 Varieties of Ground. How does that apply to modern warfare, especially in our current geopolitical climate?
The old soldier's eyes lit up with interest. He stood, moving to a large tactical map mounted on the wall.
Ah, the 9 Grounds, a fundamental concept and more relevant than ever.
He gestured for James to join him.
Come here. Let me show you something.
As James approached, the old soldier began to point out different regions on the map.
Sun Tzu's 9 grounds aren't just about physical terrain. In today's world, they're about strategic positioning, politically, economically, and militarily.
He tapped a section of the map representing the United States.
Take dispersive ground, for instance. Sun Tzu said it's when a chieftain fights in his own territory. For us, that's not just about homeland defense. It's about managing internal politics, public opinion, and resource allocation. The challenges we face in keeping our own house in order while projecting power abroad.
James nodded slowly, his mind racing.
And facile ground? When you've penetrated hostile territory, but not deeply?
The old soldier smiled approvingly.
Good. Think about our forward operating bases, our diplomatic outposts, places where we have a presence, but we're not fully committed. The key there is to keep moving, to not become complacent.
As they continued through the 9 grounds, the old soldier wove in stories from his own experiences, bringing Sun Tzu's ancient wisdom to life with modern examples.
I remember an operation in the Balkan.
He said, his voice taking on a distant quality.
We found ourselves on what Sun Tzu would call contentious ground, a strategic position that both sides desperately wanted to control. The fighting was fierce, but I knew we couldn't commit fully. The political situation back home was too volatile.
James listened, enraptured, as his father described the delicate balancing act of military necessity and political reality. The operation had been a success, but at a cost that still weighed heavily on the old general.
The hardest lesson I learned,
the old soldier continued, his voice low,
was about desperate ground. Sun Tzu said, "That's where you can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay." I faced that in Afghanistan, in a valley that seemed to have been forgotten by God himself.
He described a harrowing battle, where his unit had been cut off and surrounded. With supplies running low and no hope of immediate reinforcement, the old soldier had made the difficult decision to fight their way out.
"We burned everything we couldn't carry,"
he said, echoing Sun Tzu's words.
"I told the men there was no going back, only forward. It was fight or die."
James's eyes widened.
I never knew about that, Dad. How did you get through it?
The old soldier's gaze was steady.
By remembering another of Sun Tzu's principles. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. When men know there's no alternative, they'll fight with everything they have.
The conversation flowed late into the night, touching on each of the 9 grounds and how they applied to current global hotspots. They discussed the open ground of international waters, the intersecting highways of global trade routes, and the difficult ground of urban warfare in modern cities. As the night wore on, James found himself gaining a new appreciation for the complexities his father had navigated throughout his career. The discussion shifted to the current political landscape, with its own unique challenges.
The thing about Sun Tzu,
the old soldier said, refilling their glasses,
is that his principles apply as much to political warfare as they do to the physical battlefield. Take his advice about attacking a powerful state. His generalship shows itself in preventing the concentration of the enemy's forces.
James nodded, seeing the connection.
Like how we're dealing with rival superpowers now, trying to prevent them from forming strong alliances?
Exactly.
The old soldier confirmed.
In today's world, that means economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, information warfare. We're fighting battles every day without a single shot being fired.
The conversation turned to cyber warfare, with the old soldier drawing parallels to Sun Tzu's teachings on spies and deception.
The digital realm is our new ground of intersecting highways,
he explained.
Whoever controls that space has a tremendous advantage.
As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, James found himself overwhelmed by the breadth of knowledge his father possessed. But more than that, he was struck by the weight of responsibility that came with such understanding.
Dad,
He said, his voice quiet,
How do you balance it all? The strategic necessities, the political realities, the ethical considerations?
The old soldier was silent for a long moment, swirling the last of his scotch.
It's never easy, son. Sun Tzu said, "The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the kingdom." That's what we strive for.
He set down his glass, meeting James's gaze.
But remember, even Sun Tzu acknowledged the importance of adapting to circumstances. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows, he said. We must be like water, flexible, adaptable, always seeking the path of least resistance while never losing sight of our ultimate goal.
James nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his father's words. As he stood to leave, the old soldier called out one last piece of advice.
"James,"
he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command,
"never forget Sun Tzu's most important lesson. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." In today's world, with the destructive power at our fingertips, that's more crucial than ever.
As James made his way to bed, his mind was awhirl with the lessons of the night, the 9 grounds, the principles of deception and adaptation, the delicate balance of power and restraint, all of it coalescing into a new understanding of the challenges he faced in his own career. He realized that the conversation with his father had been its own kind of battle, a test of wits and wisdom that had left him both exhausted and exhilarated. As he drifted off to sleep, James couldn't help but wonder what new lessons tomorrow would bring, and how he would apply the timeless wisdom of Sun Tzu to the ever-changing landscape of modern warfare. In the study, the old soldier Steele remained awake, gazing out at the brightening sky. He thought of his son, of the burdens and responsibilities that awaited him. With a mixture of pride and concern, he silently hoped that the lessons he had imparted would serve James well in the challenges to come. For in this new era of warfare, where the battlefields were as much digital as physical, where economic sanctions could be as devastating as bombs, and where the line between war and peace was increasingly blurred, the wisdom of the ancients would be needed more than ever. And as the sun rose on a new day, the old soldier knew that the greatest battles were yet to come. Chapter 12. Fire and Water. The crackling of the fireplace filled the comfortable silence of General Steele's study. Outside, a late autumn storm lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a wounded beast. James Steele, home on leave, sat across from his father, both men nursing glasses of brandy as they gazed into the dancing flames.
"You know, son,"
the old soldier began, his voice low and contemplative.
"Sun Tzu had quite a bit to say about the use of fire in warfare."
James raised an eyebrow, intrigued.
Fire? I would have thought that was a bit outdated in the age of precision-guided munitions and cyber attacks.
The old soldier chuckled, a sound rich with experience.
You'd be surprised how relevant those ancient principles still are. Sun Tzu wasn't just talking about literal fire, but about the concept of using destructive force strategically.
He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames.
He outlined 5 ways of attacking with fire. Now, in our modern context, we might think of these as different types of devastating attacks, not just physical, but economic, political, and informational as well.
James nodded slowly, his mind beginning to make connections.
So, burning soldiers in their camp might be like a cyber attack that cripples an enemy's command and control systems?
Exactly.
The old soldier said, pride evident in his voice.
And burning stores or baggage trains? That could be economic sanctions that cut off an adversary's resources. The principle remains the same: target the enemy's vulnerabilities and support structures.
The old general's eyes grew distant, lost in memory.
I remember an operation in the Middle East years ago. We had intel on a terrorist cell's main hideout. Could have just bombed it to oblivion, but that would have caused massive civilian casualties and turned the local population against us.
James leaned in, captivated.
What did you do?
The old soldier smiled grimly.
We took a page from Sun Tzu's book. The material for raising fire should always be kept in readiness, he said. We had prepared a multi-pronged approach. First, a targeted cyber attack to disrupt their communications. Then we froze their financial assets, burning their metaphorical stores. Finally, we launched a precision strike, but only after evacuating civilians under the guise of a gas leak.
He took a sip of brandy, savoring the warmth.
Sun Tzu also stressed the importance of timing. There is a proper season for making attacks with fire and special days for starting a conflagration, he wrote. In our case, we struck during a major religious festival when many of the cell's leaders were gathered in one place.
James nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes.
And I suppose the rising wind he mentions could be seen as a favorable shift in public opinion or political climate.
Now you're thinking like a strategist.
The old soldier approved.
In modern warfare, the winds of public opinion and international support are just as crucial as any physical weather conditions.
The conversation flowed late into the night, with the old soldier sharing more experiences that illustrated Sun Tzu's principles. He spoke of operations where they had to be prepared for multiple outcomes, just as Sun Tzu outlined 5 possible developments when attacking with fire.
The key,
The old soldier explained,
is adaptability. You need to be ready to exploit any opportunity that arises, but also know when to hold back. Sun Tzu said, if there is an outbreak of fire, but the enemy's soldiers remain quiet, bide your time and do not attack. Sometimes patience is the best strategy.
As the storm outside began to subside, their discussion turned to Sun Tzu's teachings on the use of water in warfare.
Water in modern warfare isn't just about naval power.
The old soldier mused.
It's about fluidity, adaptability. By means of water, an enemy may be intercepted, but not robbed of all his belongings, Sun Tzu wrote. Think about how we use economic sanctions or information warfare. We can hinder an adversary, disrupt their plans, but total destruction isn't always the goal, or even possible.
James frowned, considering this.
But isn't the objective of war to defeat the enemy completely?
The old soldier shook his head slowly.
Not always, son. Remember what Sun Tzu said. No ruler should put troops into the field merely to gratify his own spleen. No general should fight a battle simply out of pique. War should always be a last resort, undertaken only when absolutely necessary and with clear, achievable objectives.
He leaned back in his chair, his expression grave.
Sun Tzu's words are a warning against rash action and unchecked aggression. A kingdom that has once been destroyed can never come again into being, nor can the dead ever be brought back to life. In our world of nuclear weapons and global economies, that warning is more pertinent than ever.
James nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders.
So how do we balance the need for strength and readiness with the desire for peace?
The old soldier smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes.
That, son, is the eternal question. Sun Tzu said, "The enlightened ruler lays his plans well ahead. The good general cultivates his resources." We prepare for war not because we want it, but because we want to prevent it. We cultivate our strength so that others will think twice before challenging us.
He stood, moving to the window to watch the storm's aftermath.
But remember, move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. Fight not unless the position is critical. Every action, every deployment, every engagement should be carefully considered. The costs must always be weighed against the potential benefits.
As the first light of dawn began to break through the dissipating clouds, James found himself overwhelmed by the depth of wisdom in Sun Tzu's ancient words and his father's modern interpretations.
Dad,
He said quietly.
How do you reconcile all of this with the realities of modern politics? The pressure to act, to be seen as strong.
The old soldier turned from the window, his gaze steady.
It's not easy, son. But that's why Sun Tzu's final words in this chapter are so important. Hence the enlightened ruler is heedful, and the good general full of caution. This is the way to keep a country at peace and an army intact.
He walked back to his chair, placing a hand on James's shoulder.
Our job, as military leaders, is to be that voice of caution, to understand the full implications of our actions, to see beyond the immediate and consider the long-term consequences. It's a heavy burden, but a necessary one.
As James prepared to leave, his mind swirling with new insights and perspectives, the old soldier offered one final piece of advice.
Remember, son,
He said, his voice carrying the weight of years of command,
in the game of global politics and modern warfare, we must be like both fire and water, powerful and destructive when necessary, but also fluid, adaptive, and life-giving. It's a delicate balance, but mastering it is the true art of war in our time.
James nodded, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the spark of determination. As he walked out into the new day, he knew that the lessons of Sun Tzu, filtered through his father's experiences, would guide him in navigating the complex challenges of modern warfare and international relations. Behind him, General, the old soldier Steele, watched his son go, a mixture of pride and concern etched on his weathered features. He turned back to the dying embers in the fireplace, a living metaphor for the principles they had discussed. In the quiet of the morning, he silently hoped that the wisdom of the past would help shape a more peaceful future, even as the world stood always on the brink of conflict. Chapter 13. The Web of Shadows. The soft glow of computer screens bathed the old soldier's home office in an eerie blue light. Outside, the pre-dawn sky was just beginning to lighten, the first birds stirring with tentative chirps. James Steele rubbed his eyes, bleary from hours of poring over classified reports.
You look like hell, son,
The old soldier said, his gruff voice tinged with concern as he entered the room, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. James accepted the offered cup gratefully.
Thanks, Dad. Just trying to make sense of this intelligence dump from our assets in Eastern Europe. It's like trying to piece together a 1,000-piece puzzle in the dark.
The old soldier settled into the chair beside his son, his eyes scanning the screens with the practiced ease of decades in command.
Ah, the eternal challenge of intelligence gathering. You know, Sun Tzu had quite a bit to say about the importance of information in warfare.
James raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite his exhaustion.
Oh, I thought his teachings were more about battlefield tactics.
The old soldier chuckled, a sound rich with experience.
Sun Tzu understood that the battle is often won or lost long before the first shot is fired. He said, "What enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer and achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge."
He gestured to the screens filled with data.
This, what you're doing right now, is the modern equivalent of what Sun Tzu was talking about. Gathering intelligence, understanding the enemy's capabilities and intentions. It's the foundation of all strategic decision-making.
James nodded slowly, a new appreciation dawning in his eyes.
I see. But how does that translate to today's world of satellite imagery, signal intercepts, and cyber warfare?
The old soldier leaned back, his expression thoughtful.
The methods have changed, but the principles remain the same. Sun Tzu outlined 5 classes of spies: local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies. Each had its role in gathering different types of intelligence.
He began to draw parallels between Sun Tzu's ancient categories and modern intelligence-gathering methods. Local spies became human intelligence, assets on the ground. Inward spies were likened to insider threats and whistleblowers. Converted spies found their modern equivalent in turned assets and double agents.
The concept of doomed spies is particularly interesting in today's context.
The old soldier mused.
Sun Tzu described them as agents used for deception, allowed to feed false information back to the enemy. In our world, that might involve planting false data for cyber spies to find, or running complex counterintelligence operations.
James leaned forward, fully engaged now.
And surviving spies? The ones who bring back news from the enemy camp?
The old soldier nodded approvingly.
In today's world, that could be anything from deep cover agents to sophisticated signal intelligence operations. The key is getting reliable information from within the adversary's decision-making circles.
The conversation flowed as the sun rose, with the old soldier sharing experiences from his career that illustrated the timeless nature of Sun Tzu's principles. He spoke of operations where carefully cultivated intelligence networks had made the difference between victory and disaster.
I remember a situation in Southeast Asia.
The old soldier said, his voice low with the weight of memory.
We had intel about a major terrorist plot, but the information was fragmented, unreliable. We needed to get someone on the inside.
He described a complex operation involving multiple layers of deception, turned assets, and carefully orchestrated information leaks.
It was like a grand chess game, son. Every move had to be calculated, every piece of information carefully managed, one slip, one leak, and not only would the operation fail, but lives would be lost.
James listened, enraptured, as his father detailed how they had eventually thwarted the plot, saving countless lives in the process.
But Dad,
He interjected,
how do you balance the need for this kind of intelligence with ethical considerations? Sun Tzu talks about rewarding spies liberally, but also executing them if they leak information prematurely.
The old soldier's expression grew somber.
That's the eternal dilemma, isn't it? In our world, we can't simply execute assets who make mistakes, but the principle of protecting sources and methods is as critical now as it was in Sun Tzu's time.
He leaned forward, his voice intense.
Remember what Sun Tzu said. Spies cannot be usefully employed without a certain intuitive sagacity. They cannot be properly managed without benevolence and straightforwardness. Without subtle ingenuity of mind, one cannot make certain of the truth of their reports.
James nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes.
So it's not just about gathering information, but about building relationships, understanding human nature, and being able to analyze and verify the intelligence we receive.
Exactly.
The old soldier confirmed.
In today's world of information overload, the ability to sift truth from deception, to understand the context and implications of the intelligence we gather, that's what separates great leaders from merely good ones.
As the morning wore on, their discussion expanded to cover the broader implications of intelligence gathering in the modern world. They talked about the ethical challenges of mass surveillance, the role of artificial intelligence in data analysis, and the ever-present threat of disinformation campaigns.
Sun Tzu said, be subtle, and use your spies for every kind of business.
The old soldier quoted,
In our interconnected world, intelligence gathering isn't just about military operations. It's about economic forecasting, technological innovation, even understanding and shaping public opinion.
James frowned, considering this.
But doesn't that border on manipulation? How do we ensure we're using these capabilities responsibly?
The old soldier nodded approvingly at the question.
That's exactly what you should be asking, son. Sun Tzu emphasized the importance of wise and enlightened leadership. In our world, with the immense power that comes from information dominance, ethical considerations are more important than ever.
He stood, moving to the window to watch the now bustling street below.
We gather intelligence not just to gain advantage over our adversaries, but to prevent conflict, to make informed decisions, to protect our people and our values. But we must always be vigilant against the temptation to abuse that power.
As James prepared to leave, his mind swirling with new perspectives and weighty responsibilities. The old soldier offered a final piece of advice.
Remember, son,
He said, his voice carrying the weight of years of command,
in the realm of intelligence, as in all aspects of leadership, integrity is paramount. Sun Tzu said, hence it is only the enlightened ruler and the wise general who will use the highest intelligence of the army for purposes of spying, and thereby they achieve great results. Be that enlightened ruler, that wise general. Use the power of information to build a safer world, not just to dominate others.
James nodded, feeling both the burden of responsibility and the spark of determination. As he walked out into the new day, he knew that the lessons of Sun Tzu, filtered through his father's experiences, would guide him in navigating the complex and shadowy world of modern intelligence gathering and analysis. Behind him, the old soldier, General Steele, turned back to the computer screens, his weathered features reflected in the blue glow. In the quiet of the morning, he silently hoped that the wisdom of the past, combined with the technological capabilities of the present, would help shape a more secure and peaceful future. But he also knew that in the eternal chess game of global politics and intelligence, the next move was always just around the corner, waiting to shift the balance of power once again.
We hope you have enjoyed this audiobook. Thanks for listening. If you like this, you might try some of our other classic books reimagined on our channel. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to find out as soon as new classic books reimagined are released.